After the chaos of Babel, when humanity was stripped of its unity and the tower of arrogance was abandoned as a corpse on the plain of Shinar, the clans wandered in confusion, each speaking a language the others could no longer understand. It was a judgment from God, but also a new beginning. The Canaanites, sons of Ham, descendants of a lineage marked by disobedience, wandered from the ruins of Babel to new lands, driven by the desire for greatness, ambition, and dominance. They walked for days, weeks, perhaps years, crossing cruel deserts, scorched hills, and nameless valleys, until one day they reached the Jordan Valley. There, before their eyes, a paradise unfolded. A green, damp, fertile plain covered with fruit trees, fields dancing with golden spikes of wheat, and a river that wound its way through it as if the earth itself were breathing. And there they said, "Here we will build our glory. Here we will raise Sodom." The foundation was brutal, as was the will of its people. Sodom was built with blood and fire, for every stone was hard-won, every inch of land irrigated with sweat and conquest. The Canaanites worked like men possessed. They carved the rock with bronze tools, tracing straight streets that crisscrossed the city like veins of order and power. They built high, thick, invincible walls as if to challenge the world to try to enter without permission. They mastered engineering. They built perfect canals that brought the waters of the Jordan to their fields, their squares, their gardens. They dominated agriculture, and the land, as if enchanted, responded to them with abundance. Figs, dates, barley, grapes, and flax. Soon, the city began to attract distant peoples, traders from Egypt, caravans from Arabia, travelers from Anatolia. Everyone wanted to see the jewel of the plain. The houses of Sodom were tall, made of white stone, with wide doors and spacious terraces. Purple cloths hung like banners in the breeze, and the aroma of incense and freshly baked bread mingled in the air. There were fountains carved with mythological scenes, hanging gardens irrigated by hidden canals, and plazas where musicians played lutes, drums, and flutes. At night, the city glowed with torches, dancing, music, laughter, and excess. The city was rich, very rich. Trade was its lifeblood. Caravans arrived laden with gold, ivory, precious stones, perfumed oils, spiced wine, and even slaves. The blacksmiths of Sodom forged fine weapons. Sculptors carved images of gods with such vivid details they seemed to breathe. Tailors worked linen, silk, and furs, all with excellence. And when the time came to establish a throne, the people elected the most cunning, the most charismatic, the most ambitious of them all, Bera, the first king of Sodom. Bera was young, with a flawless face and a seductive tongue. She possessed the dangerous talent of making the immoral seem right and the crooked shine as virtue. She ruled with a charming smile, but behind it lurked a corruption as deep as it was silent. Under her reign, Sodom reached the height of its glory and also descended into the shadows of its darkest decadence. On the other hand, at the same time that Sodom rose in the fertile lands of the Jordan as a city of power and gold, Gomorrah was built further south in the shadow of its older sister, but with a different heart, more subtle, more decorated, more intoxicated with art and pleasure. If Sodom was a jewel carved with strength and ambition, Gomorrah was a poisonous flower of irresistible beauty. Its foundation was less brutal and more aesthetic. The Canaanites who established it were sculptors, musicians, poets, and architects, lovers of detail and form. They chose the gentle hills south of the valley, where the sun set with a golden light at dusk. There, they built delicately decorated temples, streets of polished stone, and houses that looked like palaces, adorned with hanging gardens, curtains of linen dyed in purple and blue, and fountains where the water fell like music. Gomorrah did not compete with Sodom in strength, but in elegance. It was the city where the arts flourished, where songs narrated legends and theaters performed dramas of gods and human passions. The people surrendered to the delight of the senses. Each festival was a celebration of the body, of pleasures, of boundless freedom. There, the sacred merged with the sensual. Fertility rituals became mass spectacles where men and women, drunk with wine and desire, gave themselves without shame, without morals, without conscience. The first king of Gomorrah was Birsha, a man with a sharp face, a captivating voice, and a captivating gaze. He was a master of the art of pleasing the people. Under his leadership, lust was institutionalized and pleasure became law. He ruled not with force, but with seduction. Birsha fostered a culture of absolute freedom, where all forms of desire were valid. And so, Sodom and Gomorrah became a hellish duo, two jewels of power and perversion on the Jordan plain. Each fueled the corruption of the other. Among the many abominations they committed was homosexuality. The first signs came with abundance. When man no longer struggles for bread, he begins to struggle against limits. And the men of Sodom, rich, lazy, and conceited, began to pervert their natural desires. They stopped seeking women and began to lust after other men, at first in secret, then among their powerful circles, and soon, without any shame, in the streets, in the squares, on the doorsteps of people's homes. This sin was not a simple hidden practice, nor a passing deviance. It was culture. It was the norm. It was an institutionalized pride. What in other nations was still considered a secret shame, in Sodom and Gomorrah was proclaimed as a symbol of freedom, as a crown of identity in the midst of a society intoxicated with itself. They boasted about their uncontrolled appetites, flaunting it as a virtue. At the king's banquets, it was common for guests to indulge in relationships with young men brought as desire offerings. There was no need to hide it. There was no need to silence it, because in Sodom the wicked were exalted, and the voice of God had been silenced by the applause of men. Temples dedicated to false gods were places where fertility was worshipped not through conjugal love, but through acts that violated all that was sacred. Men with men, priests with acolytes, old men with young men, all under the guise of a spiritual connection, all protected under the banner of a false divinity. Pleasure was their god, perversion, their liturgy. Children grew up seeing impurity as an example. They were taught that there were no limits, that desire was the only law. They were shown images, told stories, and instructed to reject any teaching that came from a god of prohibitions. The judges didn't punish immorality. On the contrary, they punished the righteous who denounced it, and the strangers who passed through the city gates. The men of Sodom regarded them not as guests, but as victims of their lust. No one entered Sodom without being tempted, without being touched, without being tested. The most sacred act, the union between man and woman, designed by God since Eden, was trampled underfoot, ridiculed, and replaced by a culture of unnatural relationships, dominated by the desire for dominance, pleasure, and ego. There was no love, there was no fidelity, only impulse, only desire, only flesh, and prosperity. And it was precisely that prosperity that attracted Lot. While living with his uncle Abraham, Lot also prospered greatly. His flocks grew, his tents multiplied, and his possessions expanded so much that conflict soon arose. Abraham's shepherds and Lot's shepherds argued. They clashed. They accused each other. The land could no longer sustain so much blessing. What had once been unity was now tension. The harmony that once united them began to break under the weight of abundance. It was then that Abraham, the man of the altar, the friend of God, rose with the dignity of a father. He approached his nephew Lot, the young man he had taken in since his father's death. He looked at him tenderly, but also firmly, and said, "Let there be no strife between you and me. If you go to the left, I will go to the right. You choose first." And Lot lifted up his eyes, and what he saw changed his destiny. Before him lay the plain of the Jordan, an earthly paradise. It was like Eden before the fall. Green fields, crystal clear waters, sweet air. And there, shining like a temptation wrapped in gold, were the cities of the plain, and among them, Sodom. From afar, Sodom was a spectacle. Its towers reached the sky. Its markets sang with silver and gold coins. Its squares were filled with people, aromas, music, and laughter. It was a lively, seductive, and powerful city, and Lot fell in love with its beauty. He didn't ask God, He didn't seek advice. He just looked and wished. It was the beginning of the end. With confident steps, Lot separated from Abraham and descended toward the plain. At first, he pitched his tent near Sodom, just on the fringes. But like a lengthening shadow at dusk, Sodom's influence enveloped him. Soon, his business was within the city, then his home, then his heart. Lot lived in Sodom, in the midst of perversion, debauchery, sin, and he didn't leave. Although his righteous soul was distressed by what he saw, luxury spoke louder to him. Comfort lulled him to sleep. Silence chained him. He had sought prosperity without considering the consequences that decision would have on his family. So, blinded by abundance, he took his own path without considering the future of his family. There, in the midst of that corrupt city, Lot raised his daughters, pure young women, born under their father's faith, but exposed every day to the darkness of Sodom. They saw the perversion with their own eyes. They heard the screams that tore through the nights, witnessed the impure rituals performed in broad daylight. They walked through streets filled with men lost in homosexuality, where sin was not hidden, but celebrated with pride. They grew up in a place without an altar, where God's name was mocked, where the impure had become customary, and the sacred a forgotten memory. Despite this, Lot's daughters were betrothed to 2 men from Sodom, but they did not fear God. They were part of Sodom, born in its streets, shaped by its environment. They may not have participated in the worst excesses, but they were not righteous, holy, or obedient to the God of Abraham. And so life continued in Sodom and Gomorrah. Every day, these cities sank deeper and deeper into open and blatant rebellion against God. But God would not ignore this. The Almighty, who had been patient, who had waited, who had watched in silence, had heard the cry. A cry rose from the earth like bitter smoke, the cry of the oppressed, of the righteous scorned, of innocence profaned, reached the throne of heaven. And then judgment was decreed. But before the fire descended, God decided to visit his friend, Abraham. In the heat of the day, as the patriarch sat at the entrance of his tent, the Lord appeared to him, accompanied by 2 heavenly men. Abraham saw them, ran toward them, and honored them, not knowing that at that moment he was about to hear a sentence that would shake his heart. "The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great," said the Lord, "and their sin is very grievous. I will go down now and see if they have done their wickedness." Abraham shuddered. He thought of his nephew Lot, of his family, of the possibility, however remote, that there were still righteous people left amidst so much darkness. And with tears in his soul and a trembling voice, he interceded before God. "Will you also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Lord, if there were 50 righteous, would you destroy them?" And God replied, "If I find 50 righteous people in Sodom, I will spare the whole city for their sakes." And Abraham insisted, "What if there were 45, 40, 30, 20, 10? But in every plea, the answer was the same. "If there are 10 righteous people, I will forgive." Yet, throughout the entire expanse of Sodom and Gomorrah, not even that tiny bit of light was found. Evil had contaminated everything. Even those engaged to Lot's daughters mocked the message of salvation. And then the 2 angels departed for Sodom. They came down from on high in the form of men, bearers of God's judgment. The city still sang, still laughed, still reveled in its sin, unaware that its final night had begun. When they arrived, Lot was sitting at the city gate. He wasn't there by chance. He was in his position as judge, fulfilling his duty among a wicked generation. And when he saw them, something inside him trembled. He stood up immediately, bowed low, and begged them to come into his house. They accepted his invitation and entered Lot's house. They closed the door behind them, and night fell over Sodom like a thick, silent blanket. But hell was about to break loose. It wasn't long. The news spread like wildfire. Strangers have arrived, new, different men. And the rumors reawakened the city's dormant lust. From every corner, from every house, from every immoral street, they began to gather. Young and old men, all the men of Sodom, came and surrounded Lot's house like a thirsty pack of wolves. They pounded on the door. They shouted. They demanded, "Where are the men who came to spend the night at your house? Throw them out. We want to have sex with them." Perversion was no longer hidden. Now it demanded. It wanted to penetrate to every corner, to the very dwelling place of the righteous. Lot left his house in despair. He closed the door behind him and faced the crowd, his heart beating violently. "I beg you, my brothers, do not do this wicked thing." And then, in a desperate act, perhaps influenced by the culture that surrounded him, Lot offered his own daughters. "I have 2 daughters who have never known a man. I will bring them to you, and do to them as you see fit. But do nothing to these men, for they have come under my roof." But the men of Sodom didn't want the daughters. They didn't seek women. They wanted the men. Their lust was specific, misguided, violent. "Get out of our way," they shouted. "This foreigner has come to judge us. We will harm you more than them." And they turned on Lot. But then, the hand of heaven intervened. The angels opened the door, took Lot, and pulled him inside. And with a single word, with a single look, the eyes of the men of Sodom were blinded. Darkness enveloped them. They stumble over each other. They grope for the door. They curse. They scream. But they no longer see, because judgment had begun, and the clock of pardon was ticking. angels turned to Lot urgently. "Do you have anyone else here? Sons-in-law, sons, daughters, get them out of here because we are going to destroy this city." The outcry against it is so great that it has reached heaven, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it. Lot trembled. He ran to his sons-in-law, the men betrothed to his daughters, and begged them, "Get up, get out of this place, for God is going to destroy the city." But they laughed. They thought he was joking. They didn't believe him, and they stayed to die. As dawn began to break, the angels urged Lot, "Get up, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, and go out, so that you will not perish in the punishment of the city." But he hesitated. He still loved that place. He still looked back. And then the angels took him by the hand. Him, his wife, his 2 daughters, and they brought them out. They dragged them outside, for God's mercy still burned for Lot. And when they were already outside, one of the angels spoke powerfully. "Escape for your life. Do not look back. Do not stop on the plain. Flee to the mountains, lest you perish." Lot ran with his family. The sun was rising. Meanwhile, the men of Sodom and Gomorrah continued their wickedness. The streets were alive at dawn, not with worship, but with sin. The bustle was not of prayer, but of mocking laughter, of polluted markets, of profane altars, of bodies offered as worship to the flesh. The drums continued to beat in the pagan temples. The priests danced amidst incense and perversion, and no one imagined that heaven was no longer silent. The trial was already underway, and they didn't know it. And it was that moment, in the midst of their arrogance, that the heavens opened. It wasn't an ordinary storm. It wasn't rain. It was the roar of judgment. It was the thunder of the Eternal's wrath. A gigantic crack formed in the heights, as if the sky itself had been ripped open by an invisible sword. From that opening, flames emerged, alive, conscious, thirsty. Rains of fire and brimstone began to descend with uncontrollable fury. Sodom trembled. Gomorrah screamed. Houses burned on contact. Entire towers collapsed in seconds. The earth opened up, devouring its inhabitants. It was as if hell had been unleashed upon the earth. The stones burned. The air was on fire. The rivers boiled. The trees exploded. The inhabitants fled in a frenzy, enveloped in smoke, drenched in sweat, covered in ash. Mothers dragged their children barefoot through the burning streets. Arrogant men who had once boasted of their power ran like aimless animals, their eyes full of terror. The perfume of the city was replaced by the stench of burning flesh and vaporized blood. Some implored their gods. Others knelt looking up to the sky. But the response was more fire. The roofs burned. The sculptures melted like wax. And from afar, the howls of beasts fleeing into the desert could be heard, while the hearts of cities collapsed under a downpour of heavenly fury. Lot, his face covered by a blanket, fled with his wife and daughters. Behind them, hell consumed everything. But she, Lot's wife, couldn't resist. Her curiosity was stronger than her fear. She turned her head, just for a second, just an instant, and she stood petrified. Her flesh disappeared. Her soul froze. A column of salt, white and sad, rose where a wife, a mother, a woman of understanding had once stood. And as the family continued to escape, in the distance, the last gasp of the cursed cities could be seen. The ground was still steaming. The stones were hot to the touch. Crows circled over what had once been human empires. And the wind carried with it the scent of God's justice. Sodom had been swallowed up by heaven. Gomorrah was wiped off the map. For his part, Lot ran, not by force, not by choice. He ran because God was dragging him out of the hell he had called home for years. His body was safe, but his soul still trembled. His daughters followed him, covered in ash, without a mother, without land, without hope. They were the last of their lineage, the last survivors of the apocalypse. They arrived at Zoar, a tiny, insignificant city, ignored by the flames, but not by fear. There, it didn't rain fire, but it rained nightmares. Lot couldn't sleep. He saw burning faces in his dreams. He heard screams every time he closed his eyes. He felt the weight of his wife turn to salt. With a single turn of her head, there was no peace in Zoar, only a constant whisper that said, "It's not over yet." And so, fear drove them out again. Like shadows, they crept into the mountains, and there, in the solitude of a cave, they hid. Darkness embraced them. The cold penetrated their bones, and the silence spoke to them. In that abyss of solitude, without men, without people, without hope, Lot's daughters began to speak among themselves. They had grown up in Sodom, amid orgies, idolatry, and perversion. Although they escaped judgment, judgment did not escape them. And there, among the stones, the idea sprouted. An idea that can only be born from a heart deformed by sin. There is no man on earth who can enter us. Let us make our father drunk and lie with him to conserve offspring. And so they did. The first night, they prepared wine, served it, and poured it. Lot drank until he lost consciousness. And when silence reigned, the eldest daughter entered the cave, slept with her father, and he did not know when she lay down or when she got up. Sin was sown. The next night, they repeated the act. The younger one followed in her sister's footsteps. Lot, drunk again, slept with his second daughter, and she didn't know about it either. On those dark nights, deep in the cave, the sin that God had buried under fire rose again in the wombs of those young women. And from those wombs were born Moab and Ben-Ami, that would be a curse for generations. Two peoples who would build pagan altars, who would burn their children in sacrifices, who would wage war against Israel, who would blaspheme the name of the living God. Sodom's sin didn't die in the fire. It hid in a cave. It multiplied, and it became a nation. And so the world learned a forgotten lesson. It's not enough to flee judgment. You must be transformed. Because if not, the curse that destroyed a city will settle in your lineage.